And whether they were good or bad, they still laid a foundation. There were still parts that we build off of. And which leads us into what I'm going to talk about today, and that is the fact that you're pastoring a church, you think considering moving on, or you just want to hear about transitions. You have to keep in mind that other people will build on what you've done. And you don't want to destroy what you've done on the way out to make them rebuild. In the current situation that I'm in, I'm the executive director of North Dakota Teen Challenge. And the way North Dakota Teen Challenge has worked over since its inception is that everything laid on the shoulders of the director. And when you changed the director, you had to rebuild everything all over again. And so in my situation, I'll come back to it, what I realized when stepping into that role is I needed to build a structure in which it really didn't matter who led it, that the ministry continued on. And I've been at it a year, and probably the last 4 or 5 months have been the most intense of it, because we've made a concerted effort to change the way we function as a group. So, the point of being that I want to make is that you want to leave something to be built, others can build on. Give you just a little background story. I planted a church, I started the church, I built the church, and I dedicated, and I was there for the dedication, and the week after the dedication, the board fired me, just being honest about it. And I had a choice at that point, because I knew if I brought it to the congregation, and I may be lying to myself, and I will accept that, but I knew if I brought it to the congregation, I would win. I would win. But the decision that Connie and I made at that point is, why would we destroy the church just to win? Mm-hmm. You know, why do I want to rebuild what I've done? Mm-hmm. And so we licked our wounds. We walked away deeply hurt. Don't misunderstand me. Yeah. Deeply hurt. But we left something that today that church is a very strong church, because we didn't put that element in there. That was a choice we made, conscious choice at that position. And because, you know, the view we have to have is that we don't own the church. We're just shepherds of the flock. We don't own the sheep. We're just shepherding the sheep. And so, because of that, we left something for somebody else to build on. You know, was I honorable in all of that situation? Probably not. But that part of it, I was intentional. So wherever we are in the relationship with the church, my encouragement to you, if you're thinking about transitioning, don't abandon them just because you're leaving. Don't just abandon them. And I'm going to talk about a number of ways we leave the church. In God's Word, we see a lot of transitions. If you really look at it, and I'll just touch a few of them. You have the transition from Moses to Joshua in Deuteronomy 11. Moses lays his hands on him, anoints him, says, okay, you're going to take it from here. Elijah transitioned to Elisha, and I'm a fan of Elijah, and I love that transition. And this one is interesting because God directed the transition. You know, Elijah was in the place where he was burned out. And he was laying under a bush and he said, just let me die. I'm done with this. And God comes on the scene. You know, you have this whole fantastic thing where, you know, God's saying, tell him, hey, listen, get up and eat, and gives him something to eat. He said, the journey's too hard for you. And he pokes him again, wakes him up, get up and eat. And God gets involved in it. You have all this stuff take place. And God finally speaks to Elijah and he says, okay, Elijah, you need to disperse your ministry in different ways. One group is going to do this, one group is going to do that. Go find Elisha, anoint him, because he's going to take your place. And so God was involved in the transition Jesus transitioned his ministry to the 11. You know, you read the Gospels and you hear Jesus talking about, and I think this is important for us as pastoring, because one of the things I'm going to talk about is you need to prepare your board for the transition. You need to talk about this from time to time. And the fear about it, as I've looked at it, is, okay, if I sat down with the board and I said, listen, I think, I just want to talk to you about what you would do if there needed to be a transition, they're going to say, oh, he's leaving. Mm. And in Jesus' case, they didn't believe he was leaving, but he was telling them all along, I'm going to go away, and when I go away, this is what you need to do after I'm gone. So he was leading them up to the transition. And then, in a sense, Paul transitioned to Titus on the island of Crete. Mm. You have that whole transition taking place. And so from that, we get the idea that God likes healthy transitions. He loves healthy transitions, and he's involved in the transition. Now, it relates to the heart of it all, and that is, we are ministering in the church and our congregation because we love God and we love his people. Now, we may not like his people all the time, but part of what God put in us in the call was the love for people. And so, I can remember, and I'm sure if you've gone through transitions and talking to people, and they've said, we're so sorry to see you go. And my response to it is, but listen, we will always be friends. Our relationship will change because I'm no longer your pastor. I can no longer direct your life, but I can still be your friend. And in the church that I built, I established lots of good friends there. And we continue to be friends. Some have passed away since that time, but we had really great transition. So, first thing is, a healthy transition needs to be planned. You need to plan for a healthy transition. Now, Jesus told his disciples on numerous occasions that he was going to be leaving them, and that what he had brought, he was going to put into their hands. In fact, he told them that they would be every bit as effective in ministering God's grace as he was. Not implementing God's grace, because only Jesus could implement God's grace. But the promoting of God's grace, he was telling them they would be every bit as effective as he is. So we must be, and my point to you is, we must begin early to talk about what transitions look like. And that is, my thinking is, the best thing to do is within the first year or so, say, listen guys, I plan on being here forever. But, who knows what God does? And if God, something, I'm driving down the road and get hit by a bus, you need to know how to carry on after that point. So you're talking about, and if you talk about it on and on throughout your ministry time, they recognize that you're not talking about leaving. You're talking about healthy board decisions if you're not there. Mm-hmm. The problem we have run into over the years is that we don't really talk about it until we're looking at the door. And then it gets kind of difficulty. I was thinking about it. Church life has changed a lot from the early generations. Mm-hmm. Ever look at Northern Harvest? Take a look at that book that, I think that's the name of it, yeah, that Darren Rogers wrote. And he lists the churches and the pastors, long line of pastors who have pastored these churches. Because in our early days, most of them stayed only 2 years. Mm-hmm. 3 was a long pastorate. 5 was unbelievable. And if you were 10, you obviously owned everything around there and couldn't leave, But as time has gone on, lengthy pastorates have become the thing. We've recognized that the longer we stay, we have the initial impact, then in the church life, things kind of stabilize, and maybe in some ways get a little boring, you know, because everybody's kind of gotten used to you and all of those things. But if you stay beyond that, there's fruit that you get to pick. Okay, and so, you know, what's happened is we got a lot healthier churches because you have stayed longer. And things have come, you know, things that you've stabilized, got a strong church, healthy people. But what happens there is because, I'm thinking of the case of Leroy. If Leroy told his church, I'm leaving, they have not done a pastoral change in 35 years. You know, 42 years. Okay, 42 years, I'm sorry. In 42 years, they haven't had a pastoral change.
Yeah.
You know, how do they navigate that? I mean, none of them who were on the board, many of them probably weren't even born when he came. You know, so they haven't experienced pastoral change. You know, and so it has to be taught to them. Now, so life has changed a lot more over the years with pastoring. And the other thing that worked to the advantage of the church in the past was when a pastor would resign, you would have 10 or 15 resumes that would show up the next week. Because people were moving.
Yeah.
You know, people were looking for the next opportunity, and there were people that would pick it up. Where today, it doesn't happen. Ministers don't move like they used to. The other side of it, let's be factual about it. Rural North Dakota, a lot of people don't want to be in rural churches. You know, one of the things, and I can get on my horse on this one, is that is something that's concerned me, and I think it concerns a lot of people also, is that I have been in this district for 35 years, and in 35 years I've been to 35 district councils, and in those district councils we've seen scores and scores of people anointed for service, getting credentials. Where did they go? You know, and I've talked to Winston about this a number of times. You know, you see all these people, and then you were just crying for people to take rural ministry. And I don't think it's the fault of our educational system. What happens is that most people going through, when they think of rural ministry, they are not thinking of a community of 600 or 200 people. Rural ministry, if you put it in our vernacular, probably the closest to rural ministry would be a community like Jamestown. You know, they don't consider this, don't see the value in that little hamlet. And so it gets harder and harder to do. So saying that, as you look at transitions, and I'll hit it again at the end, and that is when you look at a transition, and I've worked now with a number of church boards as we've processed getting a new pastor, and that is, you know, a lot of them, churches will say, well, pastor's gone, just wait for the resumes to come. None come. I did Life Church in Williston. There was not one application. Not one that was sent to us. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking a big church. And after we got into the process, we did receive one, and I think he would have been okay, but my thinking is, my comment is, a lot of those that you may get may not be somebody you'd be really interested in. But, you know, in Williston, I was assuming you'd get all these rural pastors saying, here's my chance. None of them. But the only one that was sent to us was sent from out of state. Which I thought was pretty interesting because, you know, I looked at it and I know some of you rural pastors, I know some of the younger guys, and I think they would have been well qualified to do it. But for some reason, didn't. And so and when I talk about this whole looking at pastors as we move out, the truth of the matter is you have to go after them. That's just the way it is. Now, there are types of transitions that take place in the church. Okay, first one is the lead pastor transitions to associate, and then the pastor exits. Okay, and when I left Grafton, that was one of my considerations. I kind of had an idea. I told my wife when we went, I would pastor till I was 70, and when I hit 70, I would take a look at it. And, you know, I got to the place where I looked at it and said, you know, this church needs a younger face. And I had Daniel and Heidi come, and Lopez would be part of our church, specifically to reach the Latino population, Mexican population. And they're wonderful people. Heidi grew up in the church. She's my little girl. I mean, in the time she and I taught the youth class when I came to Grafton. She was the only one in it. And so she and I would spend an hour together every week for about a year. Then it grew after that. But there was a special relationship that developed there. And one of the things I realized as I began talking to them, we were together 3 years, was that they needed to move on. Not because I didn't think they could do Grafton, but because she needed to move out of town. She spent her whole life there. And I sat down with them one night and I said to them, listen, what do you really want to do? Because if you want to stay and pastor Grafton Assembly, I will help you every way I can. But if you don't, you know, I said, I encourage you to look somewhere else. And they're, you know, they're doing a fantastic job where they are. But I think we can plan ahead for that, and you know, bring in an associate that we work with, even in the smaller church. Most smaller churches have assistants these days, you know, and people working who are there. Now, the other one, which is not that common, but it does happen, where the lead pastor transitions to a family member. In the case where the lead pastor transitions to associate, most times the lead pastor exits. He moves on. When a lead pastor transitions to a family member, most of the time the lead pastor takes a different role. Stays in the church, he becomes pastor emeritus or whatever, and he stays in the church and influences on the backside. Now, in these two incidents, in the transition plan, it's a longer process, and as you process through, more and more responsibility is given to the person you're passing it on to. It isn't a matter of you're talking to one of these days you're going to do it, but the fact is you're making a plan and you're passing it on to them. It's kind of like teaching your kids to ride a bike. When you are a kid, right, you're teaching your child to ride a bike, you're running behind them, you're hanging on to the seat, you're letting go and letting them pedal, and you see that they're going to tip over, you catch up with it and straighten it out. And that's what that kind of a transition looks like. It's a healthy transition, you know, and the church is going to figure this out, especially in the one dealing with family, and they have to buy into it. That has to be something that's sold ahead of time, that this transition is going to take place and you're working toward that. Now, when I began ministry 50 years ago, across the river in Mandan is my starting point, and I'm in Mandan today. So I followed Ray Logan. Now, many of you here may not even remember or know who he was, but Ray was a Cullum kid as well. And I graduated from Northwest College, or Northwest University now, and I had looked at a couple other districts, and but Ray called me and he said, Dave, listen, he said, would you be willing to come and work with me in Mandan? And you know, I'm a farm kid, realize that I don't know much about the ministry, really. Not growing up in a minister's home. And I should tell you, my first encounter with ministry was pulled into the driveway at Ray's house. They lived here in Bismarck, and I wasn't married, and so I was going to live in the basement of their house that summer. and I meet Judith. She comes out on the driveway, just pulling in, and she said, Dave, we've had a suicide in the church. That was my day one in the ministry. Day one, a young lady, postpartum depression. So she left us a husband with two preschool kids and a baby. And it scared the daylights out of me. And what it made me realize is I was ill prepared for that. I wasn't. And so I prayed. I was there for 4 years. I prayed, Lord, don't let anybody else die. Okay, and we had a congregation when I came there that were all old people. I think the median age probably would have been around 80, you know. And I'm praying, Lord, don't let it. I kept a lot of old people alive because I didn't have another funeral till the very end. And at the very end was a funeral with a guy the same age as me who drowned in a boating accident. But those old people didn't start dying till I left. Hallelujah. My point is, though, that Ray worked with me for about 6 months. He was the district secretary treasurer, and for 6 months, I can remember sitting in his living room on Sunday afternoons and talking about my preaching. You know, one of those that stands out in particular is Father's Day. I'm preaching a Father's Day's message, and I'm telling them how to raise their kids. And I come home, and I can still see it today. Ray sitting in his easy chair with his feet up, just belly laughing, and he says, Dave, preach that message now. When you have your own kids, you'll never be able to preach that message. You know, and so that was kind of the relationship we had. For a year, he stayed or maybe longer, stayed as part of the church, and then he went up to Williston and worked at Eckert. But that was an unbelievable, valuable thing to have him as a mentor. You know, and so that was my start into the ministry. Now, there are other types of transitions as well. The ones that maybe we're most aware of it. One is you've had it. You burned out. You've had something said to you in the foyer before you get up, and so as you get to the pulpit, you walk to the front pulpit, and you just basically said, I'm out of here. I'm done. And surprised the whole church, including your family. Nobody knew it was coming. And then the second one is conflict with church leadership, to the point they suggest strongly or ask you to leave. Now, I would just say, because I have done some in interim, if you have an adversarial relationship with the board, almost impossible to win. You will not win that battle. You know, and if you've gotten into that relationship where it's adversarial, my encouragement to you, it's not a mountain you can win on, and you will do the church and yourself a great advantage to step aside and say, it's just time for me to go. Because if that, as it drifts into the church, you just create more conflict. And I would just put that on a personal level. Has nothing to do, don't want you to misconstrue what I say, but in the situation I walked into in Teen Challenge, that was the relationship that the previous man had with his board. Not intentional, it just grew to that. And when it grew to that, there's no way he could win. Just no way. And so you could almost, if you had looked in on the outside, you would have said, this is not going to end well. Because you can't, that's a battle that's impossible to win. Then you have the transition because of a moral failure. And that's one that I walked through. And I was in Williston for 8-10 months as I walked with them through that situation. And just to talk about that situation a moment, the church loved the pastor. They loved it. I mean, they would have walked on burning coals to save him You know, I mean, they loved him, and the board loved him, and they made, you know, they wanted to make this thing as least disruptive to the pastor that they could. You know, and in some ways that handicapped them, but that was the situation that was there. So I walked into a church that was deeply hurt, grieving, and the other side of the coin of the situation, it was a church with multiple staff. We had about 5 staff members, all in their first pastor, only been there about 6 months. They were all brand new except for the youth pastor. And so you had the lot of frightened young people, and not really well, they had been hurt, so they didn't want leadership really. And so it was an interesting walk that we took there, and I will hit on it again in a moment, how we walked through that, and one of the things I learned about the transition on that. The other one is you just feel like the church is dying under your watch. You know, and you look at it and say, you know, I want to leave something here. And if I have opportunity to step out, I would like to. And then the other one, of course, is just feeling that God is calling you somewhere else, that the anointing's left. Yeah.
Could I just comment on the previous one?
Right.
Where the church seems to be dying.
Right.
That happened to me 6 or 8 or 9 years ago. We lost quite a number of people for various reasons. I actually I went to the board because Bev and I had talked and said, you know, if we don't leave, we're going to kill the church. And I went to the board and I asked them, do you think that I have any viability left in the church? And I said, I'll leave. And they didn't want me to leave. Now, the first response was, well, we couldn't pay anybody else to come. Which wasn't really something that made me feel all that great. But they wanted me to stay. So we did stay. And I was at the church praying one night. And I said, God, if you could turn this church around, just show me. Just give me some evidence. And instantly through my mind went that scripture, faith is the evidence. And I think of God, I believe that God was telling me, well, I went home and told Bev that, and I said, now I don't know if God said that to me or if I just thought that verse because I knew it. She said, well, I think that's the way that's supposed to work though. Use the scriptures that you know, but I think God was telling me, I don't have to show you anything, just have faith. Have faith in me. And within a few months it started to turn around. And now for the last several years, we've been doing pretty good. Yeah. Quite good actually for us. We'd gotten down to 8 or 10 on a Sunday morning. Last Sunday, I think there were 40.
Wow.
And
it's great.
Yeah. But I got to the point where I'll just leave. I'll just leave. I don't want to kill the church totally. Seemed like I was already killing it. But
yeah. Well, and the truth of church life is there's ebbs and flows. Mm-hmm. In a smaller community, people move away. There isn't people moving in to catch it up that much. You know, and what's happened to you is just a real God's work. Yeah, definitely. You know, and from the outside looking in, part of what God did in your situation was that God sent you some people that felt called to help you.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, in the community people.
Yeah.
And the advantage that you had there and should be commended about is the fact that there isn't anybody in that community that doesn't know you. You know, you don't hide in your church office. You're in the community. You're ministering to it. You see the community as your ministry, not the church. And so, you know, it was a natural thing to take place where someone just felt God placed it on their heart. Yeah. You know? And so that happens.
You know, COVID was very good for us actually, because we opened up before a lot of the other churches did, and people wanted a live service, and so they thought, well, we'll just go to, because they knew me already, So they just came to ours and they never left.
Yes. With leaving a church, if you don't prepare for it, I talked earlier about with a staff member passing it on, it is like teaching your child to ride a bike. Well, as it relates to your church boards, if you don't prepare them, leaving a church is kind of like the way I learned to ride a bike. And that is, my brother and I were given a 36-inch bike. Okay, he's maybe 7 or 8, so that makes me 5 or 6 years old. And actually, we got it out of the scrap pile. The bike had been Virgil Beer's, and they had thrown it in the scrap. Burl wanted a new bike, and so they hauled it to the garbage, and my brother and I got that. That was our bike. We fixed it up. And so you're taking a 6-year-old kid and a 36-inch bike. The obvious is there. You can, straddling the handlebars, your feet are not touching the ground. Yeah. Okay? And, you know, we're farm kids. We knew nothing about training wheels. And so my brother took me, and we lived on the farm. We had the farm that we were living on at the time. The farm was up on a hill, went down into a valley. That valley, by the way, right now has about 35 feet of water in it. At that time, it didn't. And my brother just held me up there, gave me a shove. And it was either you ride or you die. Okay? And in the end, I did, you know, when it all stopped, I did end up, but I wasn't going very fast at that point. But we don't want to do this to the church. We don't want to leave them in a place where they have to try to navigate this and figure it out. So what do we do as we prepare to leave? Okay, now we want to leave the church with as few loose ends as possible. You know, as we're preparing to leave, we need to give, I know most churches, I don't know if anybody does 30 days anymore. Most of them would like 60 if you can. And as I remember leaving Grafton, I wanted to make sure all the loose ends were covered, that we put them in a healthy place. Okay, when I came to Grafton, and like I say, the ministry, great work had been done there, but in the transition, as they were leaving, as Gordy was leaving, there were some new people who were part of the church, and those new people, for some reason, ended up being in charge, having valuable roles. One guy who'd only been there less than a year became the church treasurer, okay, and taught the adult Sunday school. And so when I came, the first thing that happened was conflict. I mean, I wasn't there very long, and the thing heated up, you know, because this guy enjoyed the authority he had been given, you know, and I just kind of tell you how it doesn't really add, but it adds a little spice to this. He's coming to the board meetings. He's not a board member, and he's directing it. So I went to Pastor Freitag, who was the district superintendent, and I said, I've got this going on. What do you think I should do? He said, well, he can't go to board meetings. He can come and give a report, but he can't speak to the board. He's not a board member. You need to tell him, bring your reports or send your report, but you can't stay. He said, I'll take care of it for you. And I told Brother Freitag, I'm a big boy. I can take care of this thing. You know, so I went to his door, banged on the door. He came to the door, and I said, sir, I just, you know, we talked, chit-chat a little bit, and I said, I just wanted you to know you cannot attend board meetings anymore. And the guy blew up. I mean, he just yelled and unloaded on me. You can't make me do that. I am the treasurer of the church. And I said, yes, but you're not a board member. And we went through that, and he contacted that Brother Freitag, who said Dave's right, He contacted the Secretary of State for the state of North Dakota, and the Secretary of State said it was none of their business. He contacted General Counsel, and we don't know. We know they didn't respond. My word was they just threw it in the round file, didn't even deal with it. So we got this thing going on, and I just tell you the whole story because my teaching isn't that long. No, I'm getting to the end. I better. But anyway, the whole upshot came. That was going on. The tension was there. We're getting to the annual business meeting, first year in, and I called the church to a week of prayer. Only time the whole time I was there that everybody came to prayer, except him. He didn't come, and it was funny because we would see him driving by the church as we're praying. And so the business meeting came. It was Wednesday morning. We've been praying. We've been fasting. I drive in the parking lot of the church, and as I stop at the parking lot, I look at the top of the church, and I get this vision. It's a vision of a building that had rock foundation, and the mortar was gone, and this little guy was just stuffing the rocks in trying to put them back as they fell out. And I'm watching this thing, just kind of, whoa, and haven't had an experience like this before. And God said to me, Dave, don't try to put back together what I'm tearing apart. Mm-hmm. And that night at the business meeting, he crucified me in the board business meeting, and withdrew his membership, and everybody said thank you and let him go. But God did his work. But I just say, you have to really be careful when you move on, that you put it in responsible people who understand their role. And that is important. Now, the network office and then I would say a system in setting up a pulpit search committee. The network office has a printed material that's phenomenal. If you take that and share it with your church, if you're looking at transitions, call them and ask them for it. It's an amazing piece of material, and I've worked through it a number of times already, and it helps the church with moving forward and what they're going to see. Now, unless leaving is under tension, where they no longer want an impact from you, to offer to the system in any way that you can. Tell them, hey, I still have an investment here. I've done some work here. I wanted to include on, so offer to assist them. In Grafton, I called a few people to see if they would be interested in pastoring it, and that's a role that we have now. And then of course, encourage them to ask the network office for assistance, whether there's a minister who can step in as an interim pastor. I think the role I've played here now 3 or 4 times is an amazing role for the church. To step in and guide and just kind of be the person that you walk with them through this process. They can talk to you. You're bringing an outside influence in it. So I want to talk a little bit about the transitional, the role that I have played. And that is, as a transitional, if you've ever considered it, as a transitional, your role is to minister to the church and bring healing and help them to look ahead. And that's important. So as you bring the church along in the transition, you have to draw attention to the board, things that need to be addressed, things that you see that you want to take care of before the next guy comes. You want to bring some healing, some correction, restoration, whatever happens. And I would, I must have missed it somewhere, but I want to just, it comes, I see where it's put. Okay. Then guide the church in their call process. In every church that, in Column, I sat on the call committee. The other churches, I headed the call committee. I was in charge. And that has great value to the church. Tremendous value. It keeps one person from being in charge. In one of the churches I did interim pastor, the board were in conflict. That's walked into a really very messy tension thing half the board was against the other half. There had been a lot of, it was not healthy, and people had left the church because of it. And one group felt that the other board was too strong, and so the group that had fairly influenced, they stepped aside and said, okay, you be in charge. Well, they just wanted them to step aside, not necessarily wanted to do it. And then in the call committee, one of the guys had somebody he wanted who doesn't qualify. Okay, was not it. The Constitution required to be in good standing with the Assemblies of God. This person didn't hold a credential with the assemblies, and this guy on the call committee who determined he wanted to be in charge, he wanted that guy, but the guy isn't qualified, and I kept telling him, you can't do this, you can't do this, and they brought it through, and the other group kind of stood back, and finally they issued a call to this guy. And so I said to him, I called the guy and I said, listen, you don't qualify. You know, either you've got to become an assembly, and you need to become an Assembly of God minister before you come, because the Constitution says you have to be in good standing. Well, and he disagreed with our doctrine, particularly Pentecost, and he said, I just don't agree with it. I said, well, then, kind of a moot point here. You know, I said, why did you leave your name in? He said, well, I needed a job. Okay, and he was displaced from another church. I said, well, you need to withdraw your name, which he did, and the person who was head of the pulpit committee up to that point figured, and rightly so, that I had a hand in that. And so he didn't like me very much, and I took over the pulpit committee, and what we did was we started making phone calls. You know, and they have a wonderful pastor right now. And so as part of the pulpit committee, that works good. Now, it is very valuable to say you're going to be in charge, because most churches operate under the illusion that ministers will be beating at the door to be their pastor. Most of them operate that way, and it doesn't happen. And so, to be honest, the one beating at the door may not be the one we'd be interested in. In all the churches I have that worked in Williston, all the guys who came were people that I called and asked them to submit a resume. In Carrington, which was a year ago, that transition took place because I called the youth pastor from Williston and asked him if he'd do it, but he was looking to move on. So, I mean, I took an active part, you know, in bringing people to come and look at it, send resumes. That's the role I played. And in Williston, I had 3 or 4 guys that I called and asked them to submit. That wasn't my guy. And I should tell you that the guy who ended up pastoring, I heard about later, called him, would you send a resume? He ended up being the pastor. He was the man for the hour. It's just an amazing thing that took place there. Now, there's some things I've learned from others about interim pastoring. And that is, if you're here and thinking about being an interim pastor, preach fresh messages. Okay? They can be messages you reworked, but not just something you pull out of a file and preach Sunday morning. Preach a fresh message. And that's something I learned, somebody told me, and as I got into it, I realized, yeah, that's fantastic. Now, you're not there to just fill a slot of time on the board. You're not there just to fill a time slot so the board doesn't have to look for a preacher every week. There's a bigger role you play in there. You're there to minister Christ into their lives and to give them hope. And let's take Williston for instance, and that is, you have a whole lot of hurting people. Okay, and my message to them the first Sunday I was there was, listen, if you've got concerns about what's taking place, don't come to me. I am not part of that. I'm here to minister to those who want healing. If you need answers, go to the board. They're the ones who have the information. And in fact, I had no information about what took place until just about the very end. The details of it. I knew what transpired, but any details. Never asked, because that's not the role I played there.
It was wise.
Huh?
That was wise.
The role I played was to bring healing to move forward in that situation. Now, and initially, you make it clear that you're not to be considered for the permanent pastoral role. And let them, and just let me tell you that while you're there, if people get attached to you, and so in every church I've been, I've had people who say, well, why don't you just stay and pastor the church? You know, and that makes me feel good, you know, but I've said, no, that's not my role. Now, currently I'm the executive director of North Dakota Teen Challenge, working with the transition on them, and I have been appointed as the official, in that official position. I'm not interim, but there's a reason for that, and I also know that my period there has bookends to it. I put bookends to it. I'm 73 years old. I don't plan on being there forever. But there are certain things that have to take place, and I've told the board, and I've told, not the staff, but I've told the board there are markers along the way that I've set up where I know where I am in this. And right now we're working on just a big reorganizational plan in infrastructure, because there was none. In Williston, we worked on infrastructure. Now, and so I say that don't get involved in things you have no investment in. All right? Stay above the fray. The other thing is, you tell the church and tell the board that you'll be honest with them. You'll tell the truth. If you see something, you tell them, if I see something, I'm going to tell you what I see. We're not going to gloss over it, because we're going to fix it. You know, I learned that when I was a youth pastor in Everett, to a older guy who took an interim pastor in Hawaii, who said, he stood up to the church and said, what you did to this pastor is wrong, and I'm going to tell you why, because they had kicked him out. And he said, got to tell him the truth. And when I was in Williston, there was something, I can't even remember the details of it, met with the staff, and I said, this is what I told them, and they said, they could fire, and they said, they're not going to like this. And I said, what are they going to do, fire me? You know, because the truth has value, and we did some great things there. Now, you deal with what has to be taken care of so the new pastor doesn't have to do it. You want him to step in with as clean a slate as possible. Not everything gets fixed. In Carrington, and I'll close with this. In Carrington, they had a member who didn't like the addition that Randy Haney had built on the church, and he didn't just bring it to the church. He brought it. He had articles in the newspaper. He called television, wanted to do their investigation into this thing. I mean, he made a big mess. And so Randy had sat down with him before he left, and sat down and said, you can't come back until you have apologized to the church. So he wasn't there. Well, the youth pastor ran it. He showed up, and the youth pastor said, this is the agreement. You can't come back unless you apologize. Well, so he left there. He showed up. And I said, we're going to fix this thing. We are going to stick with it. I met with him. There were things he agreed to. And then I wrote a letter in his behalf, repeating everything he said. And I said, all you have to do is sign this and give it to the board. We're not going to make you stand up in front of the church. And he refused to sign it. The very words he had spoken to me. You know, and we worked on this thing, and there was no fixing it. And he used, but he refused to stay home too. So when the new pastor came, and I talked to the board said, well, we'll just hire the cops, we'll have a cop standing at the door. And another board member said, I was in a church that did that. It does not bode well for the church. You're not gonna win that one. And so we, they just made it clear he wasn't welcome, but we're gonna stop him. And so I talked to the pastor here. He attends every Sunday. What's interesting, he sits under the roof that he said wasn't constructed well, and with snow load, it was gonna fall on top of him, sits under it every week. Doesn't have much fellowship in the church, but he was determined, and his letter to me was, I want to win.
Wow.
That's what it became a part of. So I come back to it where we are, we're about out of time. But just to make it clear for all of you, if you're thinking about transitions, start talking about transition early on, what it'll look like in your church. That people have to consider how it is and how it works. And the biggest encouragement you can give them is take that piece that the district made and follow it to a T. I mean, it's a good piece of work they did there. And any church can utilize it. And you'll be fine. Any questions? Anything you're thinking?
I was just gonna say, I'm not thinking about retiring yet, but I have talked to the board a little bit about it, and I've even brought it up to the church, saying that I know that I'm 71, be 72 this year. I know that my days are limited, or my years are limited. But so I have brought it up, and we have talked about it just a little bit. So I think there's real value in that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. The fear is always if you bring it up, because you have people who would love to see you go too. And the fear is if you bring it up, they're going to take advantage of it. But I think if you have a strong relationship with your board and you're nurturing that, because they're the ones who are going to hold it together. But here's my advice, do not leave it to the board to run it. As good as they are, and close your ears, but as good as they are, the life of the church is something totally different than what the business world experiences. Totally different. And if I have made any mistakes in my ministry, and I've made my share, that's when I allowed the board to decide how we were going to approach problems in the church, and I let them do it. And I've paid high prices for that. In the end, if you're dealing with problems, the pastor has to be involved, because they can see things cut and dried, and life isn't that way. So my encouragement is you have a big investment in your church. Don't slam the door on your way out. Leave it open. Even to the day Matt is pastoring in Grafton, he and I talk every few months. They'll call and say, well, what do you think about that? That's a great relationship we have, seriously. And I have a big investment. I love Grafton Assembly of God. I have a love for it. And so I want to see Matt do well. I really do. And so, I have contact with people in Williston where I did the interim, and I talk to them often, because I want to see Williston do well. It doesn't matter that my name's not on it. The important thing is the body of Christ. You want it to prosper. So God bless you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks for sharing.